スファミワークスです。これはウルトラマン。As a Japanese child who grew up in the late Showa era, I naturally have tremendous affection for the Ultraman series. The true hero of the tokusatsu genre, Ultraman is... Wait, no, sorry, I got confused for a second. What I meant was, not being a Japanese child who grew up in the late Showa era, Ultraman for Super NES always baffled me. I'd see it in stores, sitting amidst a variety of more familiar and compelling titles, even late into the Super NES era. No one bought the game, it seems, so it languished in Targets and KB Toys across America. I always had a feeling Ultraman was based on something, because it had this kind of retro look to it that seemed way too specific to have been created whole cloth for some anonymous Super NES game. But in those days, before widespread internet-connected devices in our pockets to let us hunt for reference materials anywhere and any time, the name Ultraman never stuck with me long enough for me to bother to look it up on AOL when I got home or whatever. Now, of course, we all know that Ultraman Toward the Future was indeed representative of vintage media property, as seen in Game Boy Works' episode on Ultraman Club, a completely different take on the franchise than this one. Ultraman Club never made it to the US though, whereas Towards the Future hit right square in the middle of the Super NES's launch period. As it turns out, this happened for a very specific reason. Publisher Bandai hoped to kite the game in the slipstream of an attempt to bring the Ultraman TV series to America for the first time.
What is it? Shut up, it can home in on our intercom system.
This was one of many earnest efforts to localize Japanese media for the West during the early 90s, part of the same movement that gave us Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Masked Rider, Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, and eventually a tsunami of import cartoons. A toonami, if you will. Ultraman was no Power Rangers though. While Saban's Tokusatsu project became a media giant here in the US, Ultraman lasted a whole 13 episodes and was never heard from again. By the time I even owned a Super NES, the summer of 1992, Ultraman had come and gone without fanfare. And yet, the game lingered on shelves for years and years. Quite the legacy. It will not surprise you to learn that Ultraman Towards the Future comes to us from publisher Bandai. They pulled a similar trick to this early on in the NES's life. They localized a Kinnikuman game as an attempt to cash in on the short-lived Muscle Things toy fad. The similarities don't end there either. Like Muscle Tag Team Wrestling, Ultraman takes the form of a decidedly crappy fighting game. Recall that the Super NES would leap ahead of the Sega Genesis in popularity a year after Ultraman's release, when Capcom gave the platform a limited exclusive on Street Fighter II. And in case you young ones have ever wondered why Street Fighter II was such a big deal, well, here's Ultraman as an example of what the fighting genre was like before Chun-Li spinning bird kicked her way into our hearts. It's trash, basically. And it didn't have to be terrible. A fairly capable studio worked on this game, and in a perfect world, their skills would have bubbled to the surface to overcome publisher Bandai's suffocating miasma of apathy and least effort possible approach to game development. According to Game Developers Research Institute, Ultraman's development duties fell to Nova Games and Human Entertainment. Nova was probably something of a lost cause. That company produced few games during its existence, and as we saw with SD Lupin III, they were mildly competent at best. Human, though, they were champs. Although their early output was kind of all over the place, the one thing Human knew was the martial art of grappling. We saw that in the HAL Wrestling episode of Game Boy Works, a game clearly derived from their work on the Fire Pro Wrestling series, which had become a huge hit in 1989 on PC Engine, a full year before this Ultraman game debuted in Japan. One assumes the excellent showing Human made with those games inspired Bandai to bring them into the fold on this Ultraman brawler. And you know, there are some interesting ideas at play here. It's not any fun, but it's interesting. That's more than you can say for a lot of licensed games of the era. The things that define the rules of the Ultraman TV series seem like they should make for a pretty good video game premise. The show frequently involves a Monster of the Week gimmick, culminating in a one-on-one fighting match, mixing a variety of weirdo alien powers against Ultraman's space-powered martial arts techniques. Not only that, but the caustic atmosphere of Ultraman's world means that he can only maintain his giant form for 3 minutes at a time, which perfectly translates into a time limit for video game matches. Between Ultraman's time limitations and his need to power up his skills to different levels to defeat alien grotesqueries, what you have right there is a pretty respectable basis for a brawler. Unfortunately, it goes off the rails pretty much right from the start. Once Ultraman scales up to giant-sized, utilizing the console's Mode 7 feature in the most canonical way imaginable, the unpleasantness unfurls immediately. In the game's attempt to capture the scale of the characters involved, it turns each match into an agonizingly sluggish exercise in tedium. Ultraman moves slowly, and his basic skill set limits him to punches and kicks. There's no ducking here, so the only way you can evade projectiles is to backflip out of the way. Enemies ramp up in difficulty quickly, so even though there are less than a dozen creatures to defeat, it's ridiculously difficult to make it even past the game's midpoint. The problem is that Ultraman mostly has to rely on melee attacks, while his opponents have no such limitation. They employ all sorts of ranged beams and projectiles at will, making it extraordinarily difficult to close the gap and get in close. It doesn't help that your evasive maneuver takes you away from foes. Now, it wouldn't be fair to say that Ultraman can only use melee powers. He does possess the ability to blast bad guys with an energy beam. It's a limited resource that recharges over time, but it exists. Your beam slowly builds through 4 power levels, and you can use the controller's shoulder buttons to cycle through the different levels. If you zap an enemy with a level 1 beam while fully charged, it'll only drain a single level's worth of power, while a level 2 beam will deplete 2 levels worth of charge, etc. That's all well and good, but the problem is that you can't actually defeat an enemy unless you zap them with a level 4 beam. Not only that, but they have to be at critical health when you do, and once you knock them down to critical, they only stay that way for a few seconds because monsters have regenerating health. In other words, the only way you can win a fight is to beat your foe's life meter down to 0 while your beam attack is charged up to level 4. Toggle your skill select to use the level 4 beam, and zap them with the beam before they recover any health. It's a cumbersome, frustrating design convention that forces ridiculous constraints on each match, not least of which is turning your already limited ranged attack capabilities into a precious resource that you dare not use. You have a handful of lives with which to reach the end, and 0 continues. This may be a 16-bit game, but it was clearly cut from the 8-bit cloth of creating quote-unquote replay value through hostile design and grinding repetition. To my knowledge, Towards the Future was the only Ultraman game ever released outside Japan until some little-known mobile game hit iOS in 2013. And understandably so. If this was the best first impression the franchise could make, it was doomed from the start. Not that the other tokusatsu-based games that would reach the US were particularly impressive either. Next on Super NES Works, though, it's the good stuff. Hell yeah. Or maybe it would be more appropriate to say, heaven yeah.